Ladies and gentlemen, it's 2025 and the Paimon being the unknown god theory is still running rampant. And now with the release of the Shade teaser, there's just even more fuel added to the fire simply because of this one line uttered by Renova, the Shade of Death herself, with a little help from Istaroth.
It's clear that Asmoday is not here.
But you're right. There's no trace of Asmoday here. Where has she gone?
What if she just switched sides?
Just switched sides? You make it sound like such a trivial affair. We are shades, shadows of the heavenly principles. It's unthinkable. Unless she loves her new master more than her own self.
Well, for those of you who need a quick catch-up, here's what we finally learned from the Shade teaser. This here is Renova. The Shade of Death also happens to be the creepy collection of eyes that we saw in Natlan's Archon quest. This one right here is Istaroth, the Shade of Time, and the same one that we had heard to be connected with Mondstadt's God of Time, and was the only shade to have helped the ancient nation of Enkanomia when it had fell into the Light Realm. And then we have a big confirmation we finally got, and that was the fact that the unknown god, the one who separated us from our sibling, was indeed Asmoday, the Shade of Space. And the most interesting one of all, as we have heard from Albedo in Paralogism, is that Nibirius, the Shade of Life, has now combined her existence with Rhine-Daughter, one of the 5 sinners of Khaenri'ah, one of the members of the Hexen Circle, and Albedo's master, and is now acting somewhat like Rhine-Daughter's own version of Iron Man's Jarvis, becoming that sort of, nagging voice inside of her head, while Rhine-Daughter herself remains to be the one in control of their physical actions. Now, the teaser showed us a lot of interesting things, and one of the first things I noticed is the notion that the heavenly principles seem to have included any knowledge about the origins of the twins as part of the list of knowledge now considered as taboo. Just like how any knowledge of the sovereigns and the history of Teyvat before the heavenly principles arrived is also banned from being read by present Teyvatian beings. The reason I thought of it this way was because at the start of the teaser, we watched as an old lady told the tale about the 4 shades, and we would think that her pain afterwards would have been associated as a consequences of her talking about the 4 shades, since it has been mentioned before that the shades never really like any living being talking about them. But it is worth noting that the old lady only mentioned the shades' individual titles and not their real name, which is really what Yohwal Tekutin mentions as the thing that the shades actually dislikes, living beings mentioning their real names. It was only when she, looked like she was being taken over and began talking about the tale of how Asmoday had separated the twins, was she then literally shot down by a ray of red light from the sky, presumably of Renova's doing, and disintegrated out of existence, which makes me think that it was less about the mentioning of the shades, but more about mentioning the knowledge of the twins' origins that really got that old lady into trouble. Though it was then shown that this whole space and the overall existence that we were watching was really an experiment that Rhine-Daughter was doing, I'd like to think that she was doing it to measure just how far they are able to push the boundaries of the heavenly principles' rules. All while also trying to figure out what has happened to Asmoday, because it looked like she hasn't been around the shades in a while. Istaroth also joined in Rhine-Daughter's funnies since she was the one who gave that old lady the history of the twins in the first place. It's kinda ironic considering the happenings in Natlan that Renova, from this very brief interaction between the shades, actually seems to be the one who had the most sense out of all of them. I mean, Rhine-Daughter is sitting there freely experimenting with newfound life creation powers, and Istaroth bestowed presumably taboo knowledge upon those lives, literally because she was just bored. Renova was really the only one who was trying to at least make it look like any of them had any modicum of sanity. And from there we see Renova just cleaning things up, and then the 3 of them properly have their meeting in this fancy universal chamber kind of thing, acknowledging that Asmoday's disappearance was something that they probably, should look into. But Istaroth came up with an interesting theory, and that is the notion that Asmoday has switched sides. Of course, a lot of the old theorists immediately flared up and pulled the Paimon is Asmoday theory out of their dusty old closet, mostly because, throughout the development of Genshin's story, one of the most obvious growth that we saw is just how much the Traveler grew closer and closer to Paimon, From the Traveler hugging Paimon after their experience in Caribert and the wholesome reunion in Atlan Stadium after people almost thought that the Traveler were dead, it's clear that Paimon has grown to really care for the Traveler. A lot of the other parts of the theories has been made through simple observations. White hair, both having the capability to fly, Paimon clearly having Celestia ties. Couple that with the one time in the Book of Esoteric Revelations World Quest where that one Melusine mentions that, to their eyes, Paimon looks like a rainbow balloon with a string that extends to the skies. There are quite some teasers that may point to Paimon being Asmoday, or at the very least have direct connection with the Heavenly Principles itself. I wasn't really someone who looked into this too deeply, especially all the way back then, but it is kind of compelling if you were to look at what the theorizers have put forth as evidence. It also is convenient that the shades are more formally known as the 4 shining shades, and that, you can argue that a rainbow is created due to light interacting with something, so the Melusine's perspective of seeing Paimon as a rainbow balloon can maybe be associated to the shades in that manner. If you want to go even further with how far you can reach with this theory, we can also make it so that things make a lot of sense with Paimon being Asmoday because of her in-game mechanic behaviors. While yes, she looks like she can pause time with the pause screen, that is still something that happens even if we don't have her around like that one time in the Caribert quest. But the more Asmoday feeling connection is that she can also manipulate her own sense of space by pretty much disappearing out of thin air. And we know that this isn't just some in-game mechanic because multiple characters in the story, including the Traveler themselves, have recognized this as something that she can actually do. And I can even reach further and ask about how we are able to store all those artifacts, equipment, and just all the items that we've gathered throughout our exploration and pull sessions without having a giant house constantly being by our side. Or maybe because we actually do. If Paimon does have the ability to manipulate space, then maybe that's where all our items go. It would make funny sense considering the fact that unless we use shortcuts, we do access our inventory through the Paimon menu, as well as any other piece of knowledge that we may have or need. Well, but in the end, it's just fun to think about, regardless of how far of a reach it may end up being. But from my own perspective, there is an angle from this whole Paimon is Asmoday theory that I really want to just try and expand for a bit. And it all has to do with making the connection between that theory and the Battle Pass teaser regarding the twins. It's a tale as old as time, this thing is. Once there was a princess who was tasked to seek a big shiny pearl that was in the Kingdom of Darkness, only to get duped and suddenly become the princess of that Kingdom of Darkness instead. And of course, as we now know, it is now the job of the new heir, the new prince, to do what the princess couldn't. And really, honestly, this whole thing is kinda why I always considered Aether to be the canon playable twin and that Lumine is the canon Abyss sibling. Plus, she just has much more of that evil sibling aura to her. The Abyss Aether version just oftentimes look like an angry small little brother type of vibe. But anyway, my perspective of how Paimon can be Asmoday or is an envoy of Celestia sent by the Heavenly Principles is that she was sent to our side in order to make sure that we do not fall off the set path the way the Abyss sibling had done. And the reason why it could make sense that Asmoday is the one sent to be by our side is because, well, she was the one who caught us in the first place. Maybe in some way or form, her act of intervening with our escape from Teyvat was seen as something that might have gone against the rules of the Heavenly Principles, or as something that was seen as Asmoday overstepping her permitted authority. It's clear from what we know of the Shade's previous lore and the teaser itself is that the Heavenly Principles doesn't really tell the Shades much of what they do or why they do things, and that they are very strict in terms of how they want the Shades to run things, while simultaneously also having some sort of a vague rule set to govern how they run things, because it doesn't even look like the Shades themselves know exactly what are the rules and what they are allowed to do in their authority. Even Renova's whole give me a life to borrow my power scheme was something that the Heavenly Principles viewed as an overstepping of their authority. So it really wouldn't be a surprise if the Heavenly Principles decided to tell Asmoday to do things while keeping the other Shades in the dark. Maybe as a way to sort of punish her or make her own up to something. And here's a little theory of what that something may be. At first, Asmoday might have suggested to use the Abyss sibling to fix something that was going horribly wrong in Teyvat, and the Heavenly Principles agreed to it. But because of the fact that there was no direct supervision and that the Abyss sibling ended up traveling with Dainsliff, they weren't able to prevent the Abyss sibling from turning to the side of the Abyss. So this time around, the Heavenly Principles decided that, hey, you brought them here in the first place. The first plan was your idea and it kind of failed miserably, so this time around, you go keep an eye on the second attempt yourself. And maybe to further hide the involvement of Celestia, because, you know, they really don't like having their involvement be known when they didn't want anyone to know, so they are certainly not doing a good job with this floating emergency food. The Heavenly Principles then turned Asmoday into Paimon to essentially become the CCTV and correction officer to our actions, all while the Heavenly Principles went into their recovery slumber. It was even implied through the Melazine Kiara in Nouvellette's story quest that Paimon may be a lot older than we all thought, so it could potentially fit in a timeline where Paimon was Asmoday and was only turned into her new form after the Cataclysm to serve as a guide for us later on. She's also resistant to a lot of the things that normal Teyvat beings aren't resistant to, and she's even resistant to some toxins or elements that heavily affects us, the Traveler, such as whatever it is that Scaramouche used to knock us out during the Inazuma Archon quest. It's clear that she has much more affinity with certain elements that we have yet to really understand. And that is also kind of why Renova doubts that Asmoday has actually switched sides, because it would mean that Asmoday loves her new master so much that such love exceeds the love that Asmoday has for herself. To me, it's not entirely because Asmoday might be a complete narcissist, although, you know, that can also still be very well the case, but it seems like it was more because to forsake the Heavenly Principles for another master, it kinda means that she's risking her own existence. Since, you know, going against the Heavenly Principles when you are under their direct rule, regardless of who you are, can quite literally lead you to a death sentence. Go ask Orobashi. Though of course the other side of the speculations is that Asmoday may not be Paimon at all, and that this new master of hers may be more related to the Abyss because, well, the opposite of Celestia and the Heavenly Principles, if we were to take it in simplicity, would be the Abyss. Or maybe Renova was referring to the actions of the Tsaritsa and the plan that she is currently doing with the Gnosis. Maybe Renova was implying that Asmoday was defecting to that side of the camp. Or maybe it has something to do with Alice again because, I don't know, every time we don't really know much about something, turns out she's involved in some way or another. We don't know, but it sure is quite an interesting suggestion that Istrat had come up with. Though admittedly, it would really be funny, however, if Istrat was just being a little shit who was saying whatever she wants. From that little bit we've seen of her, you know, spreading taboo knowledge just for the fun of it, I really wouldn't put it past her. Kinda starting to give me some Sparkle from Star Rail vibes right now. But there's a chance that she was also just being blunt. Any side that isn't going along with the Heavenly Principles may just look like opposition in her eyes. Who knows what she's thinking then? In any case, that's the gist of the whole Paimon is Asmoday theory. There's still a lot of mystery that surrounds Paimon's existence in Teyvat in general. Like, really, she is still the one blot that we haven't really been able to truly figure out. At least the Travelers are obvious. They ain't local. That's really it. But Paimon? She looks local to the gods, yes, but barely anyone that we've met in the entirety of Genshin's story have ever even acknowledged the weirdness of her existence. Albedo really being the only one to say that she was interesting. Meanwhile, everyone just sort of treats Paimon as something that they see every day when we've literally never seen anything else that looks remotely close to her in terms of physical existence. But then again, between her existence, aliens being involved, and now with the Vatui having what looks to be bases ripped straight out of Star Wars, though I probably shouldn't be surprised considering the Khandria roots of the Harbingers and the industrial complexes that the nation used to have, but there's a lot of things that Genshin's bringing right now that is just making my head spin. I'ma just look forward to not cry and hope that I can still keep up with a lot of it. Alright, that's about it. Thanks for coming in and giving this a watch. Until the next video, the name's Leafy, and I'll see y'all next time. Sayonara.